Thank you for joining us today for the Historic Property Reinvestment Information Session for GRM cities. I am Diana Rogers, and I'm Senior Community Development Officer here at the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. I'm going to begin now by just giving you a bit of information about the EDA. And so for those of you who are joining for the first time, and you may not be familiar with the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, we do serve as the state's principal agency for driving economic growth. The EDA, as it states here, we are committed to making New Jersey a national model for inclusive and sustainable economic development. My role here at the EDA, again, is Senior Community Development Officer, and I work specifically with the 3 cities that were designated or identified as Government Restricted Municipalities through the Economic Recovery Act, and those cities being Trenton, Atlantic City, and Paterson. My role here at the EDA is to ensure that all 3 cities are made aware of all of the products and services that are available to them as a result of the ERA, as well as work with developers, investors, business owners, and community organizations that are interested in products and services offered by the EDA. And so today is one of those days where we are making information available to you to learn about how you can utilize the Historic Property Reinvestment Program to support development activities with historic properties and properties that are in historic districts. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Adita Milstead, who is Director of Historic Preservation.
Well, good morning, everybody. As Diana said, I'm Adita Milstead. I'm the Director of Historic Preservation here at the EDA. And prior to working at the EDA, my experience basically been the gamut, but started with, I have a background in architecture and historic preservation. I worked as a historic preservation consultant for years. And then after that, I also had for about 15 years worked in construction management. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about the program. I'm going to run through the basics of the program and also try to focus and pinpoint in some areas where there is a difference and benefits for GRMs. So first, the very basics of this. This program was created by the Economic Recovery Act of 2020, which was signed by the governor on January 7th, 2021. The ERA created or amended over 15 programs, which is most of what we do here at the EDA. And it's basically tax incentives, financing, grants, and the like. And of course, the Historic Property Reinvestment Program is one of the newly created programs by the ERA. And of course, the Historic Property Reinvestment Program is kind of the fancy name for the New Jersey's new historic tax credit. So quick information on the program. The program is set up so it can work in conjunction with the Federal Historic Tax Credit Program. There is some things that are a little different, but in essence, there's a lot of the bones of where the program started and the information, how it was set up in the statute that is meant to work together with the federal program. And there's some definitions and some of the information calculations, financial calculations, definitions on eligible costs and all that are meant to mirror the ones on the federal program. The program is a $300 million fund of tax credits over the course of 6 years, which translate to a $50 million annual cap in tax credits to be issued. Not project cost, but that is the actual tax credit to be issued a year. If we have any year when we're undersubscribed, meaning we don't give out the entire 50 million, we have the ability for that money to transfer and roll over to the following year. Awards under the program range between 40 and 45% of the rehabilitation costs, which are eligible costs, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, a little more detail. The program is a competitive program, so that means basically that all applications are due by a pre-established deadline, and the projects and awards will be based on competitive scoring. So there is a minimum score that all applications must meet to be able to receive or be considered for an award. And then on years that we're oversubscribed, all the applications will be ranked based on the scoring, and awards will be based on that ranking. Obviously, because what we do here at the EDA is, focuses on economic development and community development, this program looks at historic preservation as a component of community development. The program was new rules for the programs. The draft rules were approved by our board in February of this year. And as of earlier this month, they have been published for public comment, and that window for public comment closed a few weeks ago. And we had, I believe, one comment. And it was very, small comment that with some questions and comments, but that is being addressed. We expect that the rules will be adopted as they were originally drafted. So we are in the process of dealing with that. So with that, I figure it's be helpful for particularly those in our audience that look at the project from more of a development side, to have a general understanding of what the process looks like. So first, again, the program is competitive, so the steps here are set up in taking that into account. The first thing that would happen is that we have the business entity, which is what our program calls the applicant. So the business entity would have to submit an application by the pre-established deadline. We have application windows. We have a window open right now. And we will try to have at least a couple months of that window open. The current window open on the 15th of this month, and it'll be open to August 15th. So once the applications are all submitted, they all will be received, and they will be taken in and reviewed all at the same time. There's two simultaneous reviews that are happening kind of in tandem. So we will have, on the one hand, legal reviews and the financial reviews like underwriting and the like, that will be happening by a team of from those departments at the EDA. But then the applications and the program has scorable criteria, and that scorable criteria will be reviewed by a selection committee. And the selection committee, in all cases, as per our rules, indicate that will be made of at least professionals with, at the very least, areas of expertise in historic preservation and construction. This year, we have a team that includes people with specialties in historic preservation, construction, and urban planning. And it's made up from staff both at EDA and other state agencies. So we are looking at this process very similarly to those who have worked on public or state projects before, of a kind of state procurement process. When you're looking at a procurement that includes a selection committee review. So everything will be looked at together by the selection committee. They will be scored and ranked. And once that happens, then they will be presented to the top scoring ones, or up to what to get to our total 50 million or whatever the number is for that year. If we have money from a previous year, they will be presented to our board of directors for approval. Then we'll go to the board, and there will be a board approval, and it's at that time that awards would be issued. This is also the one time during the process that somebody who has some concerns or questions with regards to how the application, the review, scoring, or anything like that happened, that they will be able to appeal a board action after the board action becomes official, which is after a veto period. So what would happen at this point is, once you get board approval, this deviates a little bit. So anybody who's worked on the federal program is that at this point, we will do a full review of Secretary of the Interior standards, which is a requirement of for the program. At our initial review, when the applications are reviewed, we will be looking at generally how the applicant or the project is taking into account Secretary of the Interior standards. However, we felt that it was very important to leave the full review of the standards to happen after an approval is issued, because this would allow for back and forth discussion between the potential awardee and EDA. So we are not making decisions on a project that is almost there, but not quite there, because we cannot have some back and forth. So that's why this was moved to this point. At this point, also after the approval, is when any applicant would be expected to start submitting final financial commitments, with the expectation being obviously that when you come in, you may have some commitment letters for financing, but your deck may not be fully complete because you may have conditional approvals from others. So our approval is the EDA's approval commitment on the issuing of the tax credit that then will help an applicant be able to get financial commitments from other sources of income. So as this is all happening, this process, when we are done with the Secretary of the Interior review and all the conditions for the approval have been met, meaning all the final documents have been submitted, then the rehabilitation agreement will be signed. That is basically the award, the contract that says that you have agreed to do this, we have agreed to issue this many, up to this many tax credits based on these conditions. So that agreement, there is a little bit of wiggle room with regards of, there's a timeline by which it has to happen, but there is a little bit of wiggle room for the applicant to decide when that agreement is signed and executed. And the reason for this is that it is at this point, when the agreement is finalized and executed, that the clock starts ticking with regards to construction durations. Because as we'll talk a little bit later, there's two potential durations, maximum durations for the program. So when the agreement is done, that's when the clock starts. The construction happens by the pre-established duration that you have selected. And then at substantial completion is when that clock ends. Once that happens, we enter into a period that is a compliance period. And there is 3 components of that compliance period. There is a time frame of up to a year, although there is potentials for extensions on that time frame, in which you have to provide final documentations showing final project costs, showing you have paid, this is the final true cost of the project, because until this point, we're going with estimates. Once that happens, then that's when you can submit for your certifications and issuance of your tax credits. In this program, issuance of the tax credit happens at one time. Once you complete the project or a phase of a project, you show final costs, you can submit for the certificate, and a full certificate would be issued. In this time frame, there's also a 5-year annual report requirement. And at this time, there is some requirements, including very similar to the way it is in the federal program, where you are not allowed to make any changes to the property that would make it, theoretically, would not have made it eligible for the program. So you cannot, if there's minimum requirements for how many residential units, if you're doing a residential project, you cannot change. You said you were going to have 6 residential units, and now you're going to have only 2. You can make changes to the exterior or to the historic fabric of the building. So there's a number of things that you cannot make those changes, because if you do, there's the potential for recapture on your credits. After that, then there is an additional 5-year timeline in which there's a prevailing wage requirement for building services. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but for the most part, this is basically janitorial services for the project. So I know I just kind of threw up a ton of information there for you, but we'll go then into a little more detail about some of these items. So first, we'll talk briefly about what the eligibility criteria is for the program. The eligibility criteria for the program, obviously there's some that are very specific to this, but many of them are meant to be compatible with other ERA programs. So the first one being that the applicant has to show that without the tax credit award, the rehabilitation project is not economically feasible. You also have to show that there's a financing gap that exists. and the financing gap has to be at least equal or more to what you're asking for. So you cannot show a financing gap, for example, of $500,000 and then request that you want a $2 million tax credit. The applicant also has to show that the construction or rehabilitation work has not started. And this is very clear in the statute. There's very little wiggle room on this. The only exception is if there is an issue that is a health and safety concern with the building, and you have proof of, for example, a local building official that is requiring some corrective work to take action, and then you're only allowed to take that action and that action only to correct the health and safety concern. There's also minimum requirements for project equity, which is money, skin in the game from the applicant. For most projects, it's a 20% equity. However, for projects that are located within GRMs, that equity only has to be 10%. The equity can be either cash at hand, or in some cases, it could also be money that has previously spent in soft costs. For example, you already hired an architect and an engineer, and they've done drawings and structural studies and that kind of stuff, and you have already spent that money. That money spent could count towards your percentage of equity needed. There's also some a requirement with regards to minimum rehabilitation costs, and this is equal to the one in the federal program, which basically you have to show that your project, you're spending more than the greater of either $5,000 or the value of the building itself, not the land, but just the building. And again, this is the definition on this is, I believe, almost verbatim, if not verbatim, what it is on the federal tax credit program. If the project is a residential project, there's also minimum residential requirements. The first one and most important one being that it has to have at least 4 residential dwelling rental units in the building. So that's at least 4. Also, if you are creating new residential units, so it's the building didn't have the residential units before, and you're creating newly created residential units, at least 20% of those newly created units need to be low or moderate income units. And then finally, this kind of catch-all statement, which is that the project needs to be a rehabilitation project, which basically, this is the definition in the rules, and it's basically, construction improvements that includes the rehabilitation of a qualified property or a transformative property. So now the question is, what is a qualified property or a transformative property? So those are the 2 types of properties that the statute and the rules define. So there's 2. Here we go, qualified and transformative. So the first one, a qualified property, and I will say that in our program, the projects that have a qualified property in it is what we're calling regular projects. And then the ones that have a transformative property is the ones that we're calling transformative properties. So our current application window open now is for regular projects, which means this is the requirement that you need to have. So when it comes to qualified property, it's really meant to be just its minimum requirements with regards to historic designation. Aside from the generic, obviously the property has to be in the state of New Jersey and it has to be income producing. So, and this language that is here is what comes from the statute and is kind of a little bit all over the place, but basically what it means in simple, plain English is that for you to be able to qualify for the program, your property must have been previously identified as historic in one of 4 ways. It has to be either listed in the National Register, or listed in the New Jersey Register, or must have been identified as historic by the Pinelands Commission, or finally, and this is kind of sounds a little confusing, it talks about significant resource but municipality in accordance with criteria for identification or registration that has been approved by the officer. And basically what all that means is that it must have been identified as historic by a certified local government. Currently in New Jersey, there is 47 such certified local governments. Out of the 3 government restricted municipalities, 2 of them, which are Atlantic City and Paterson, are certified local governments. In either case, whether it's national, New Jersey, Pinelands, or CLGs, the property needs to be either individually identified as historic, or it could be as part of a district, but if it's a district, it needs to have been identified as contributing to the significance of the district. And I want to emphasize one last time that when we're talking about National Register and New Jersey Register, we're not talking that the property has been found to be eligible for listing. The property has to actually have been listed in one of the 2 registers, okay? And this is a question we get all the time. And this is a main difference between the federal program that allows you to do a tangent nomination while you go through the process for the federal. For our program, you have to have been previously identified. Then we go to transformative property. And for transformative properties or transformative projects, the bar is significantly higher. So there are requirements both about financial, location, and historic designation. So as with qualified property, again, it has to be in New Jersey, it has to be income producing. However, for transformative property, the project cannot include residential. It cannot be a residential project. And the applicant must show to the authority that the project will generate substantial increase in state revenues through the creation of increased business activity within the surrounding areas. Again, this is verbatim from the statute. The property also must be listed in the New Jersey Register of Historic Places, and it must be individually listed. So unlike the qualified property, when it's a transformative project, it must be individually. Then it also must have received a determination of eligibility from the keeper of the National Register of Historic Places, and this designation must precede the enactment of the act. Which, if you remember taking notes from the beginning, the governor signed in January 7th of 2021. So if you don't have a determination of eligibility that predates that date, then you do not meet this requirement. Those 2 requirements, the New Jersey Register and the DOE, make this there's not very many properties that have both of these type of designations, and listing in the National Register cannot replace the DOE. It has to be a determination of eligibility, and this is very, very clear in the statute. On top of that, there's also requirements with regards to location. So you have to meet by 1 or 2 ways the location requirement. So I'll do the second one first. It's always the easiest one, which is that it needs to be located within a government restricted municipality. So this is one of the other benefits for GRMs. And again, those, I realize we didn't really cover what those are, but I'm assuming most of you here know that, but they're Atlantic City, Trenton, and Paterson. So you have to be either located within a GRM, or you have to have located within a half-mile radius of the center of a transit village, as designated by the NJEDA, and located within a city of first class. And currently in New Jersey, as of the 2020 census, there is 3 cities of the first class, and those are Newark, Jersey City, and Paterson, which just made it in the last census. They require to have a population of at least 150,000 residents. Okay, so the other thing that is important to know is that the program allows for 2 rehabilitation periods, and we kind of talk briefly about this and that big graphic with the process, the snake process. So at the time of the application, the applicant must select one of these. So you are able to do either a 24 months, and that's for a project that is going to be completed in one single phase. Or if you have a multi-phase project, then you have up to a maximum of 60 months. And we have in our rules some additional information about what facing means, but for the most part, the faces need to show in the architectural drawings and plans and specifications for the project. However, there is things that a lot of projects have, like a demolition phase and the like, that if they're broken separately could be considered a phase for this purpose. You must define and select one of these, because you are kind of married to the one you pick at the beginning of your application, with some very few exceptions. Okay, so the award side. So the size of the award, again, this is another one of those places where there is a significant benefit to the GRMs. For most regular projects, the tax award would be 40% of the rehabilitation cost, which means eligible costs, up to a maximum of $4 million. However, here, the one that is kind of in the little faint green in the middle, if your project is located within a government restricted municipality or in a qualified incentive tract, that number goes up to 45% of the cost of rehabilitation, up to a maximum of $8 million. So the number can be substantially higher just by nature of your location. And then there is the obviously the Transformative Project, which is the bar, as we clarified and talked about earlier, a significantly higher bar. That one, you can get 45% up to a maximum of 50 million, which it's basically the entire pot for the year. If we had a year in which we had a transformative project that basically depleted the whole amount, we do have the ability to borrow from a subsequent year, with the goal of always having some money that can be used for regular projects and not just transformative projects. So now we talk a little bit about the review of the applications. And again, as I said earlier, there's kind of two parallel tracks here, one with the legal and underwriting, and then there's the scorable criteria. Under our program, the scorable criteria is divided into 5 different categories. The first one, and it's the one with the most points, is the historic significance of the property, followed by existing and potential threat, in that to the resource. And the point of that is, if you have everything else being the same, if you have a building that is in a serious threat, where if you don't get this money, if this project doesn't move forward, it may be lost. They will be able to get some additional points to, if you have 2 applications that are the same, hopefully the one that needs it most can get ahead. Then the second highest scorable section is the project concept and team, and here we have everything from information on the different members of the team, as well as we want to know exactly what is the concept on the project concept, what is it that you're planning to do, and basically give us a full approach. This is where we want to know that you understand what the requirements are, you understand what the significance of the resources, that you tell us how you're going to deal with the Secretary of the Interior standards, that you're going to tell us if there's an issue with archaeology, you have a plan for if there's a previously unknown archaeological site on the property, etc. We have site control that just has to do with show us that you have a path to site control, you own the site, or you have a lease. So you cannot just randomly submit an application for a site that you don't own or know anything, and the owner is not aware that you're doing this. And then finally, if there's going to be a positive impact on the surrounding neighborhood. Here we want to talk and hear about what is, if there's support from the community, is there a potential for this to bring additional work or businesses or foot traffic to your neighborhood and the like. And like I mentioned earlier, there is a minimum score that you need to obtain, and that is 50 out of a possible maximum 100 points. So here is kind of a little quick breakdown of what all these sections are and the specific information that we asked for each of them. I would also advise anybody who's interested in more information on this that on our website, our page for the program does have a document that outlines and explains in detail each one of the scorable criteria that we take into account. But this is kind of the longer than the previous slide, but the short version of all the different things, individual things that we've looked at. Everything from the significant type of designation, importance, if it's a National Historic Landmark, threat, we're looking at vacancy, building envelope, threat of encroachment, concept and team, like I said, approach, the experience, schedule, cost estimate, permitting status, that kind of stuff, site control, and then again, the community surrounding, impact on the surrounding neighborhood. We're talking about, benefits to the neighborhood, support, and the potential to attract more business to the area. Alrighty, so now wanted to go through a couple of things that are important to point out on the program. And these are things that could, be a bit of a hang up for some. So it's important for you to be aware that these are requirements of the program. Number one being the prevailing wage requirement. All construction activities on the program must be paid at prevailing wage. And then there is that building services requirement that extends for 10 years after the building goes into service, which is basically when substantial completion is reached. The only deviation to this is if you have a project that is completed in multiple phases, the clock on the 10-year building services start at the conclusion of the first phase. So if you have a 5-year construction duration, but your first phase ends after the first year, excuse me, you start, you have a 4-year heads up on when the clock for the 10 years building services start. Then we also have requirements with regarding affirmative action. Oh, excuse me. And this has to do obviously with affirmative action rules in the state. And this applies to all the construction activities during the project. Then with regards to the transfer of credit, there's some requirements here. The business entity, or the applicant, is able to sell or assign the tax credits in part or in full. However, there is some restrictions on this. Number one is that for most projects, it could not be sold for less than 85% of the value. I'm so sorry. So you cannot sell them for less than 85 cents on the dollar. For residential projects, however, that have received federal low-income housing credits, they can sell them for no less than 75%. So it's 75 cents on the dollar. And then the final restriction on the transfer, and this is a very important one, is that there could be only a one-time transfer. So the business entity or the applicant or a co-applicant receives the tax credits, they can sell it to one entity. That entity cannot sell it any further. So it's only a one-time transfer that could happen, okay? And that applies to all of our programs. So as I just mentioned, there's also, our program allows for a co-applicant. The co-applicant is always defined as a 501c3, so it's a non-for-profit. And it cannot be just a random non-profit that you bring into the program. That nonprofit has to have something to do with the program. They have to contribute either capital, real estate, like real property, services, be an anticipated, like they're going to be using the building, be a tenant, or run the facility. There has to be a connection with the property and with a project. And finally, To prove all of that, you need to have a participation agreement. So as part of the application, we will require that you submit information and a participation agreement between the developer and the non-for-profit co-applicant showing their participation in the project. Of course, the benefit on this is that when you get tax credits and you have a co-applicant, the tax credit will be issued always when you have a co-applicant, will be issued through the co-applicant, who, since they are a non-for-profit, that means that any further transfer or sale of the credits will be able to take advantage of the not-for-profit tax benefits of the co-applicant already. So now I kind of mentioned them briefly as we went through, but there's three main benefits to the government restricted municipalities for the program. The first one is the equity for GRM projects within GRMs. 10% of total project cost is the required equity versus what is for projects outside of GRMs, which would be 20%. The 10% versus the 20%, as we said, can also come, some of it can be based on soft costs that have already been incurred prior to the application. There's also benefits with regards to the award calculation, in which, again, you can do up to 45% of the eligible cost up to a maximum of 8 million, versus for other projects that is 40% and maximum of 4. And then finally, for those very, very small number of potential projects that would fit the definition on their transformative project, there is the location benefit on the GRM that is one of the allowable locations for transformative property or transformative project. Okay, so with that, then let's talk money, right? So the program fees are based on a 3-tier structure that splits the projects on size of the project and type of the project. So the first tier is with projects that have a rehabilitation cost up to 10 million. Second tier would be projects that are over 10 million. And then the third tier is for transformative projects, specifically just for transformative properties or projects. All the fees are going to be the same. So I'm just going to go kind of quickly go through what those fees are on this table, and then I will quickly show the other ones. This information, all of this information on the fees is also on our website if you want to take a look at it later. So we have an application fee. Self-explanatory, is due at application time. Then we have an approval fee, and this is a fee that you would have to submit once you know you're being recommended for an approval. And it's due prior to us going to the board, and it's one of those, for all the work that it takes for us to get documentation ready to go to the board, and to make sure that the applicant is still moving forward with this and has skin in the game before we go to the board, because at that time we are recommending and basically earmarking all the money for that year with our board presentation. So that's $5,000. Then we have an agreement fee, and the agreement fee is due right before that agreement is executed. That's the contract we talked about. That's what starts the construction schedule timeline. This fee, if you'll notice, there is on those two columns, for the second and third column, there is 2 different fees, because there is, what we're calling a discount fee for projects that have prior approval of the Part 2 for the federal tax credit program. So what does this mean? So what it means is, if you have a project and before you apply to this program, you had already started the process with the Historic Preservation Office at the EP for the federal program, and they have already signed off on your Part 2 for the federal program, which basically means they have already reviewed you for Secretary of the Interior standards, we will accept that sign off, and we will skip our Secretary of the Interior review, and therefore you're getting a discounted fee of half the money, because part of our review will not be done, because we are going to accept the review that was done by the other agency. one of the reasons we're doing this is because it's a significant reduction in the amount of work that we have to do, number one. But number two, it makes sense because ultimately when we will be making those reviews, doing the reviews for the Secretary of the Interior standards, we will be conducting these reviews in consultation and working very closely with the Historic Preservation Office. So we want to make sure that we are all in agreement on these things, and there is not a situation where you apply for both programs and you have conflicting information. We are working really hard to try to prevent those things from happening, and that's why our process has been set up in a way where we will be working with HPO every step of the way. Then the certification fee is the fee that when you finish a project and you paid everybody and you have your final numbers, that's what, when you pay that fee, when you submit for your certificate to be issued, your taxes to be issued. And then finally, there's a transfer fee. And that is if you choose to monetize, sell, transfer your credits, that's what you need to pay for that to happen, for requesting a certificate, transfer certificate to be issued for you to sell. We also have modification fees if there's a change that needs to be done, whether it is, you know, right before the agreement or after the agreement. And this could be anything from some small change, and small changes, administrative changes, that's the smaller amount. Or it could be doing construction, there's an unforeseen and you have a change order, you need to make a modification, then that's a more major or addition modification. That one is a $5,000 fee. So here, what we're assuming is, again, we're not assuming everybody needs a modification fee. We're assuming most applicants will want a transfer fee because most people will probably be monetizing this. So with that in mind, we're looking at is probably around $27,000 in fees for the life of the project, or $22,000 if you had gone to your federal approval before. So this is for the small projects up to 10 million. And these are 10 million of eligible costs. This is not total project cost. The project could be significantly larger. This is eligible costs. Then for projects over 10 million, as you can see, the numbers go up and you have up to about 70,000 for the total life of the project cost. And then the big one, which is the transformative projects, because again, remember these projects are looking at potentially up to 50 million in tax credits. Those fees take that into account, obviously, and they're significantly higher. We have a couple of quick additional ones that are for extensions. These are a 6 months extension prior to agreement. That means between award and the agreement, if you need more time to put your documents together, or you need more time to be able to get your clock started at a more advantageous construction schedule timeline, you can apply for a 6 months extension. Post-project completion extension, that is once building goes into service, you get a substantial completion for the building, and you need more than the timeline under the rules is a year. If for some reason you have not been able to finalize all your final payments and all your contracts within that year, then you can ask for a 6 months extension. And then finally, an agreement transfer is that if for some reason you need to sell or transfer your rights to the project to somebody, to another entity, then there's a fee for that, because there will be a significant amount of work that the EDA would have to do to make sure that we validate and approve that transfer of the agreement. And after a lot of stuff, that is it for us. And I am going to pass it on to Dorothy.
Good morning, everybody. So I was asked to participate in this morning's Zoom to talk about the Historic Trust programs. I'm with the New Jersey Historic Trust. We are the entity in the state of New Jersey that, before the tax credits, was the primary funder of historic preservation. In New Jersey, we were created in 1967, so we're a very old organization, but we got going with grant money when the first bond referendum was issued in 1987 that included historic preservation. We're we're governed by a board that's appointed by the governor. And at this point, I just wanted to mention to you too, in terms of our funding, if you all remember in 2014, there was a referendum on the ballot, which asked the voters if they would dedicate a portion of the corporate business tax to open space, farmland, and historic preservation. And that's where our funding comes from. We're the part that administers the historic preservation coming from the corporate business tax. So we do have an annual program. There's money every year now for preservation, which is a good thing because it allows people to do some planning. Most of the information I'm going to share with you this morning, because I'm going to quickly go through what our program is with this idea that you may be able to combine both these programs if it works for you, but they're in our grant guidelines, and we do keep the guidelines up on our website. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about, which is a little different than from what IDETA was talking about, is our eligible applicants. Because our program, the origins of this, typically funded sites that were tourism sites or sites open to the public, historic sites in the community. We also funded public buildings like city halls or county courthouses. So our applicants need to be an entity of government, either local or county or state. And we also fund the nonprofit community, the 501c3 organizations. And the reason why we believe there could be a potential for stacking is because the tax credit can also use a co-applicant as a 501c3 organization. We look to make sure that you either own the site that you're applying for in fee simple, or that you have a lease that at least goes into 15 years from the date at which the governor signs the appropriations bill. And our lease needs to talk about that you have the ability to do the work that you're applying for funding for. Eligible properties, also a little different than the tax credit. You can be individually listed in the National and New Jersey Register of Historic Places, but in order to get started with our program, you could also be determined eligible for listing in those. We can be also contributing resource in a historic district and locally recognized. Our program allows you to start with just a certification of eligibility. In order for us to reimburse you for construction monies, we'll get into later, though you do have to be listed in the New Jersey Register of Historic Places. But this is a little different than what IDETA was talking about. The programs have to already have been listed in the register. Our criteria for reviewing grants, again, we look to see what your significance is. When you see some dates in here, I pulled these slides from our last grant round, so everything's related to the round that we're evaluating right now. We typically put out our applications now in January. They're due in mid-April, and our board makes its recommendations at the end of September. We're trying to stick to this schedule, so barring any other pandemics or anything, we're trying to do this on an annual basis. One of the other things that we look at is if the building is somehow threatened, either by its condition or threatened locally by inappropriate development. We also look at the project concept and team, who's doing the work, who's managing the project, what's your budget look like, is the schedule okay? And this is some of the things that we take into consideration when we're evaluating a project. We look at who's applying, the organizational, and again, 501c3, have you been taking care of the property? Do you have a long-term commitment? Do you have your matching funds in hand? And I'll get into the matching funds a little bit later on. And do you have the ability to raise funds in order to, if you come in without having all your money in hand, are we sure that you're going to be able to come up with this? We also look at public benefit, and here's where if we do get applications that are trying to use the tax credit and our program, this may be something that is a little bit more difficult to understand, because if you have a site that's open to the public, it's easier to write about the public benefit. However, there's lots of other public benefits, and as we move forward with this, if we do see applications that are combining the two, we may need to massage some of the language in the public benefit because you have to tell us why we should be funding this. Does it complement other state initiatives, community support, and then also, will our funding make a difference in the quality of the project? One of the other things that our board typically looks at is geographic distribution. So we want to make sure that we're covering the whole state. We're not tied to just municipalities or any sort of geographic area. So our goals of our program is to try and spread our money around. We do have an archaeological requirement for wherever there's ground disturbance. We do need to assess the potential for uncovering archaeological resources. Just keep in mind that we also pay for the archaeology as well. And that is something that will come up while we're reviewing the application, and also maybe a condition on your grant if we see that there's a need for it, and depending on what the activities in the grant are. Anything like trenching that has to do with electrical lines or sewer lines, if you're doing landscaping, you're doing grading, all of these things may present the need for doing archaeology. And these are the different types of grants that we have available. So the first one is called a Historic Site Management Grant, and that's really a planning grant in short. We can make an award from $5,000 to $75,000. That's just been upped. We used to do $50,000, we've increased it. And we do a 75% match on that. So if we give you $75,000, we expect you to come up with $25,000. Just briefly, we also fund heritage tourism planning under the same 75% match. Our construction grants are divided into two categories, a level 1 and a level 2. The level 1s is up to $150,000, and we'll put in 60% of the project, and a level 2 is up to $750,000, and that's a dollar for dollar match. We have created this new category of multi-phase. And what this means is that if you have a larger project that we're willing to commit, we'll review the application once, and we'll commit to a multi-phase approach on the project, and we'll put up to $750,000 per phase. And again, dollar for dollar match on this. But we did this because for some of these very, very large projects, it seemed to be easier if you had a long-term commitment for us, if there was bonding or someone needed to take out a loan. And it also makes it easier on the applicant and us, because we don't want to review the same application several years in a row. So this has been something that we've been just starting to fund. So far, it seems to be working well. And it's still, as I said, a dollar for dollar match. Okay, let's be a little out of order here. All right, so under our planning grants, as I mentioned, these are the types of activities that we'll fund. Preservation plans and historic structures reports are probably the one we fund most. We'll also fund the preparation of a state and national register nomination. We do master plans, landscapes, condition assessments. And if you take a look at our guidelines online, there's probably some more activities in there that we will fund. And we said we had a new category. There was never anything preventing us from doing this in the past, but we've now sort of modified our grant guidelines as well as our application process to take into consideration municipal and county and regional planning projects. And things that would come under that is architectural surveys to actually identify historic resources in a community, creating design guidelines if you have an ordinance in place. We'll pay for the preparation or revisions to a local historic preservation ordinance, and then also for a municipal master plan. And our funding can also match a federal certified local government program as well, in case anybody out there is from government and is wondering about that too, if you're in a CLG community. And as I mentioned before, we're a 3-to-1 match. We'll fund up to 75% of the project, and you need to come up with a 25%. And in terms of the application, just very briefly, obviously we need a title and summary. We need to see the budget. We need to know about your organization. And then we also ask a question on here is if you have attended any of our workshops, or if you're getting any education on, there's a whole series of places there, because people who come in cold with applications, it's really difficult. It's much better if you meet with the staff or you attend our workshops, because then you're more able to answer the questions with the way of our evaluators want to take a look at these. And then we also look at the public access, and again, taking into consideration, I just flipped that screen off, the pre and post COVID. So it's another thing that we take a look at. And again, with some of the projects that you might be thinking about where you're using tax credits, we would have to take a look at the public access. Is the exterior, is there a lobby area? Are you doing retail on the ground floor? Again, making the case for that public access. Just briefly, I wanted to go over that we do fund heritage tourism. A lot of our sites that we fund are open to the public. So we're also trying to help sites get ready for visitors. We're looking at visitor ready assessments. interpretive planning, design and fabrication of interpretive signage, marketing plans or studies. And then again, we also look at for county organizations, or if they're doing workshops that are fostering heritage tourism within their region. And then the capital grants. So as I mentioned, we fund construction activities. We do preservation, restoration, rehabilitation. We also do the barrier-free access, and we require a project sign, obviously. We are funding archaeology. The actual, if you have to do an archaeological survey on the property, we will fund it as part of your construction and consider it part of the construction costs. We will do reconstruction. We say up to 20%, and reconstruction is putting back something that we know historically was there. So think of it as like a portico, or if there was a little shed addition off of a building, something like that, but we will consider that. And when we think about new construction, we've added the word visitor amenity to our eligible activities. And this deals with trying to get sites ready to accept visitors. So it's more of a heritage tourism activity. But again, it's what sites told us that they were in need of in order to enhance the visitor's experience to their site. As part of construction grants, we'll also fund up to 20% of the project budget for consultants fees, which are construction documents, planning, design, the administration. And getting into the matching funds, again, I think I went over this already in terms of the level 1 is the 60-40 split. Our level 2 grants is $1 for dollar. One thing I would mention here is that we will allow other programs, state programs, to be matched to our program, except that you can't use other corporate business tax money. So if you were getting a grant from Green Acres for some reason, you couldn't use that as a match to our program. You can use federal money, and I'm pretty sure the tax credit would be just fine because it's not. We haven't tried that yet, but I'm sure that that's just fine. The only thing we're restricting is the actual corporate business tax. If there was a special appropriation for your project in the budget, as does appear every year, there's usually a list of special. You can't use a special appro to match our grant either. So in terms of match spent, this is the other area where we differ from the tax credit. So if you came in with a construction grant in April and you had already started your project, or at least maybe you've done your construction grants or your construction documents in advance, we will allow up to 2 years worth of match spent, as long as it doesn't exceed 25% of the total project cost. And the work has to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for preservation. So you can use match spent when you come into our program for a grant. In terms of control of the property, as I mentioned, you either have to own it, or you have to, if you don't own it, we have to see a lease that's at least 15 years. It can't be revoked at will. And we do need to see an authorization by the owner, just to make sure, again, that you're not applying for a grant that the owner knows nothing about. A grant agreement must be in effect within 18 months from the date of the appropriation, and the capital work itself needs to begin within 2 years from the date of the appropriation. So I think there's a lot of wiggle room in that. As I was listening to IDETA's presentation on the tax credit in terms of their timetable, I think there is, I don't think there's a problem in trying to match up our grants with the tax credit timelines. I think that is doable within these windows. We do have an audit requirement. So if you're receiving more than $100,000 from a state or federal grant, we do require an audit, and we don't pay for the audits. Okay, so all work has to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. I think I just skipped over that project, that slide, but that is the same that's used in tax credit projects. It's the same that's used by the State Historic Preservation Office, and the same standards that are used by the federal tax credit. We basically, that's what governs us, and that is the review that we would be holding your project to. Again, the capital application, just briefly going over the steps that we require, and then our criteria for review. So number 1 on the list is always historic significance, the property information. Clearly within our grant application, if you are a National Historic Landmark, or you're a key building within a historic district, these things will count maybe just a tiny bit more in terms of the application. We also look at the project concept and team. Does it make sense? Do you have the right people doing the work? We look at the budget. Is it reasonable? Did you come up with a whole list of things you want to do, but we don't think the budget is going to be able to cover it? Did you overdo it? Where did you get your cost estimate? Did you have this professionally prepared? So we do take a very serious look at the budget, because once we make an award, we typically aren't able to go in and give you extra money if the project runs out of money. We look at the organization. Are you a preservation organization? Do you have consultants on board? Do you have personnel on board? Are you able to steward the property after the money is spent and the building's restored? And then, as I mentioned, we do take a look at the public access and the public benefit to the project. In our applications, we typically ask for letters of recommendation, not just from legislators, although those are important to us in our office, but we also look at the community. Is there support from the mayor? Is there support from community organizations? Who's going to be using the building? Who cares whether this building is there or restored or whatever? So we do want to hear from the community that our money is being invested wisely. Again, these are the types of things, I don't need to belabor this in our application, that we're taking a look at. Again, just trying to see if you've organized your project carefully, if you thought about it. And then we're always looking to make sure that under the last project substantiation, again, that the cost estimates were properly prepared, that you have historic architects working on your project, and that you have an approach to the project that's going to get a good outcome. Okay, and I think I've pretty much gone over this slide. In terms of documenting the match expended, as I mentioned, you can, in our program, you can come in with a match expended, and as long as the work has met the standards, we will count that towards the project budget. We do need to see proof of payment, the invoices. We probably will ask you for the canceled checks or some proof that the money has been paid out. And it is limited to 25% of the total project cost. And there's that public access and benefit again, which we've already gone over. Just a quick mention of, again, for this past year, and this will probably be for next year, we do have special initiatives every year. And again, this is a nudge to the community for things that we think are important. Right now, our special initiatives are the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War is coming up in 2026. So properties that are demonstrating that they are taking that into consideration one way or another, either the resource dates to the 18th century, or there's some sort of programming going on or some sort of nod, that will help with your application. And the other initiatives, underrepresented histories, again, trying to tease out those stories that may not have been prevalent in the National Register nomination, may not have been understood, but you're taking a new look at the properties. An example of that is we have a number of properties in New Jersey that had an enslaved population. The National Register nomination may never have mentioned it, no one may ever have talked about it, but these types of stories are coming to light now, and we want to encourage our applicants to tell us about those stories. And these other, I mentioned already that we were doing municipal planning. We've never not done it, but now we're making sure that people understand that we will fund your master plans and your surveys in your community. And I just went over our special initiatives there. And I think we've made it to the end of my presentation, and I wanted to make sure that we left time for questions. The one thing I'm mentioning again, we haven't really had projects that have combined the tax credit yet, because it's too new, with our program. And as we move forward, if we see that this is working, we will feel the need probably to massage our application fee and how we rank projects a little bit, or maybe create a separate category, because I think the projects you would be looking at or using the tax credit for are going to differ slightly from what we've been funding. But there's nothing to say you can't do it as long as your applicant is a nonprofit organization or an entity of government. So with that, I will stop sharing. I know I went over all of that pretty quickly, but it's all on the website.
Well, thank you, Adita and Dorothy, for that wealth of information and providing such a comprehensive overview of both the programs. And so with that, we are going to open up to questions right now. We do have a few questions that are in the Q&A.
Regards to eligible costs and when are they determined. So our definition of eligible costs is tied to what the definition is under the federal program. And we try to mirror our definition to the one that is under the federal. tax credit program. That being said, the way our application works is you would submit a cost estimate showing what all your costs are, which would be include total project costs, which is everything, and eligible costs. That being said, we know things can change. These are estimates. And at the end, the final award is based on true actual costs. So when your project is done, before your credits are issued, you have to show actual cost. And the final award will be based on those actual costs. There is one caveat here, which is, since we know that sometimes in construction, not everything is perfect, we are going to, as part of our review, we will be taking what the cost estimates are. We're going to review what those estimates are, and we are going to be adding an 18% contingency to eligible costs. So and that contingency is owned by the EDA, but if you have a situation where there's an unforeseen circumstance that requires a change and a modification, which will require some kind of a change that would increase the eligible costs up to that amount that we have on this contingency, that eligible cost number theoretically can vary up, but up to that maximum. But at the end of the day, final number will be determined on actual dollar spend up to a not to exceed amount, which is the one that we will be issuing the award for. So I don't know if I made this more complicated, but that is kind of the gist of what eligible costs are. There was also a question about site control. I wanted to clarify, site control, you don't need to own the property or lease the property at the time of the application, but you need to, at the very least, show a path to site control. That could just be written communication from the owner saying, you know, if the project move forward, I'm going to lease the property to this person, or I'm going to sell the property to this person. So there has to be something in writing that shows that the owner is aware and is willing to enter into this agreement. With regards to the length of the lease agreement, we only require, I know the federal program requires significantly longer lease agreements. We only require a lease agreement that extends to the end of the compliance period. So once you are done with all the requirements with us, your lease does not have to extend beyond that point. And then finally, there was a question, and there might be more questions now, I see them popping up, but there was a question with regards to nonprofit and how having a co-applicant that is a nonprofit is taken into account when it comes to feasibility. Ultimately, feasibility is a pass-fail. It's not a scorable item. It's part of our underwriting process. And though obviously some of our other programs require net benefit reviews and studies, that is not the case here. Here we're looking at more standard, and it's not a penalty to somebody who doesn't have a non-for-profit. It's a benefit for somebody who does. So it takes into account, it's taken into account only to the point that the last dollar and cent penny that could affect this would affect your ability to show feasibility for the property. But again, it's a pass-fail. It's not something we're going to be scoring. And this is something that when you would submit, it would be reviewed by underwriting team, and they do have the ability to do some back and forth. So there's that.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty, so I just want to start with this first one where it's asking about the government restricted municipalities. Just to answer your question, this program, the Historic Property Reinvestment Program, is a statewide program, as well as the Historic Trust. It is not specifically for the government restricted municipalities of Trenton, Atlantic City, and Paterson. This is just that these three cities have been identified, and we try to work with them. But this is a program that is across the state, as Adita mentioned throughout the presentation, as well as Dorothy. So there's no requirement to be a government restricted municipality in order to apply for these dollars. So the next question for the New Jersey Historic Trust, if for-profits are not eligible for the New Jersey Historic Trust grants, is there any potential overlap of the tax credit eligible projects with the New Jersey Historic Trust grant opportunities? For example, if a co-applicant and the property is publicly owned, but the project is for profit.
So for us, our applicant needs to be a nonprofit organization. So as long as you can make it all work, that the for-profit entity is applying for the tax credit, but the nonprofit entity that's a co-applicant is applying to us. Yes, we can make that, we can, as long as you're a nonprofit and all those other things are met, yes, we can fund that. So there is the potential there. It just hasn't, I don't know that we haven't been done all that much actually. So, but it's there, the potential's there.
That you just have to have a part. If in a project where there's a partnership that is a for-profit and a non-for-profit, it's just in a weird way the applicants are kind of turned around. Like the applicant for Dorothy for the trust would be the co-applicant for us. But yes, there is a possibility for that.
Okay, perfect. And Dorothy, there's an announcement, and hooray for the Day Mansion
Day Mansion. I saw that.
Dorothy's slide, so they're
Yes.
happy. Next question. Good morning. The CRDA is looking to assist the Absecon Lighthouse with a significant renovation of the structure. The preliminary estimates are in the $3.5 to $4 million range. I would like to set up a Okay. So yeah, we could set up a meeting, or
I'm going to say from my end, I cannot set any meetings till after August, but I'm sure they can talk to Dorothy, just not with me right now.
That's come into the office already. The request came through DCA. So yes, we are the funder for the Absecon Lighthouse. So yeah, we can definitely set up a meeting and talk about that. And that might be a good candidate for a multi-phase grant, since there's a huge amount of money there.
And I will clarify that because our program is competitive, while our window is open, I can only answer general program type questions. I cannot answer questions that are project specific or even hypotheticals. After August 15th, when the window closes, anybody can feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to meet with anybody. We just talk about your project. We just cannot do it while the window's open.
Okay. And what if a historical church building is in danger of being demolished? What?
Okay.
We do not own the building.
Okay, so again, we can fund a church building as long as it's not being currently used as a house of worship. The Supreme Court came down and said that we can't use state funds for properties that are houses that it violates the Constitution if there's actually holding worship. However, this is an abandoned building or building that's not in use. We can fund the church building itself, but again, our applicant needs to be an entity of government or a nonprofit organization. So someone needs to adopt the building, work with the diocese or whoever is still the owner of the building to try and get the site control away, or at least come to us for a planning grant. So you can look at options for the building and what's the condition, what might be the cost estimate, what is potential reuse on the building. So again, because of the applicant structure of this, we can't just make a grant to citizens group. They have to be in a structure of some sort. Historical Society, HPC is an entity of government, something like that. And we can fund a planning grant without a long-term lease being there. We don't require the long-term lease for the planning grant. We require it for a construction grant. So, and again, call our office. We can talk some more about it.
Okay, perfect. Does EDA prefer or recommend the sequence when the state and federal credits are being used? One first or parallel?
So technically we don't. And I think particularly definitely this year, maybe there'll be some of it next year. We understand the complexities of the fact that there was this program is brand new. It was hard for people to plan ahead because people would not know when the rules were going to be ready, when the program was going to really roll out. So my expectation is both projects for this year and probably even next year, where we're going to have all kinds of different versions of this. Ultimately, we meet with the Historic Preservation Office once a month, and we talk about all the projects coming in and that kind of stuff. We are aware and we work with them. So I think the very long answer to this is that it's going to depend on what the schedule for your project is. There might be a project where you can do them at the same time. And we have talked with HPO about what the process would be like for that and how we're going to work together on that. But there may be a project that could benefit of moving ahead and doing the federal first. If they're not ready to apply for us or their window for us is not open, I can see how a project may choose to start moving with the federal while they wait for our window, because the time is not wasted, since the Secretary of the Interior standard review will be ongoing then. But it just, it was really going to depend on what the project is and what the anticipated construction schedule for the project is going to be, and what our window, where our window timeline fits into that.
Okay, perfect. Zita, I'm not sure if you answered this in your previous answer, but it says a nonprofit sponsor will give a for-profit applicant a significant financial advantage in that there would be no federal tax due if the tax credit certificate is sold by the nonprofit.
Yeah, so this is it's a general on the feasibility happens at the underwriting, and they just have to, it's a pass fail. It's not there's not going to be any scoring associated with this. So the advantage, there's no real advantage if you want to put it as with regards to scoring or ranking. Is just a matter of you're going to show if this is needed for you to be financially feasible, for the project to be financially feasible, and your pennies are down, you're down to the last penny, it may play into whether or not the pass and fail, but you're not going to be scored on this.
Okay, perfect.
And there's a question for Dorothy on the when the grant program is generally open.
Oh, so we will be announcing our next round in January, with applications due sometime in mid-April. So we're trying to stay on a cyclical basis because of how our funding comes in. It's more or less, it's getting pretty routine and more predictable than it has been in the past. And so we're trying to keep to an annual schedule. At this point, we will be offering all the same categories, the planning, tourism, and construction money again next year.
If there are no additional questions and folks would like to exit, you can do that. And we, again, are available. As Adita said, there only general questions can be answered at this time regarding the tax credit program until after August. But Dorothy is available to answer questions about the Historic Trust. We want to thank you for your participation this morning. If you have any questions about other programs at the EDA, you can definitely reach out to me, and I will connect you with the appropriate team leads at the agency. Additionally, if you are with any of the 3 GRMs, and if there are other programs in the state that you are interested in, we can also make sure we try to connect you with our colleagues at our partner agencies. But with that, I want to thank you for your participation. Have a great day.